There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the plain clothes of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, and they slip in under your guard. You don't recognize them as pivotal until much, much later, when you're looking back, trying to pinpoint the exact second the world tilted on its axis. For me, that moment smelled like old books and Julian's shampoo, a scent of sandalwood, and something clean, like fresh linen. It was the weight of his arm, draped heavily across my chest, pinning me to the worn fabric of our living room sofa. His breathing was a slow, deep rhythm against my side, a current pulling me into a state of suspended animation. I was a photograph, held in the dark room of that moment, waiting to see what would develop. The central, unavoidable fact of the situation, the one my mind kept circling like a nervous bird, was that Julian hated cuddling. He had declared it on multiple occasions, with the casual certainty of someone stating their opinion on cilantro or superhero movies. He'd said it was constricting, too hot, that he couldn't sleep if he was being touched. He'd gesture dismissively at couples in films, entangled on a couch, and mutter something about performance art. "Nobody actually likes that," he'd say, and I, a silent traitor, would just nod, my own secret yearning a coiled thing in my gut. And yet, here he was, deeply, irrevocably asleep, his body molded against mine as if they were two parts of a whole, his arm a solid, possessive weight. He hadn't let go. He hadn't stirred for hours, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty that felt like falling, that he wouldn't let go until morning. I didn't dare move. I barely dared to breathe. I just lay there, a willing captive, cataloging the paradox. To understand the sheer, seismic significance of that arm, you would have to understand the architecture of our friendship. We had built it over years, a sturdy, reliable structure with clear lines and designated spaces. We met in college, a classic study in opposites drawn together by the magnetic pull of a shared, obscure interest. I was a photography student, most comfortable behind a lens, observing the world from a slight, protective remove. My natural state was stillness, a quiet waiting for the right light. Julian was a force of nature. He was a computer science major who had signed up for a notoriously difficult art history seminar on Dutch masters simply because he'd heard the professor was a character. He moved through the world with a restless energy, his mind a flurry of code and algorithms, his laughter a loud, uninhibited thing that could fill any room. He was all kinetic energy. I was all potential. Our friendship was forged in the fluorescent hum of the university library after midnight, fueled by lukewarm coffee from a vending machine and shared bags of stale pretzels. He would try to explain the elegant logic of a recursive function, his hands sketching invisible diagrams in the air, and I would try to explain the emotional weight of the chiaroscuro in a Rembrandt portrait, the way light could tell a story that words could not. We didn't always understand each other's worlds, but we were fascinated by the view. He was the only person who ever asked to see my contact sheets, to look at the frames I discarded, and he'd point to a blurry, imperfect shot and say, "I like that one. It feels more real." I was the only person he'd call after bombing an exam, not for sympathy, but to have me listen while he methodically deconstructed his failure, turning it into a problem to be solved. My feelings for him were a quiet, insidious bloom. There was no single moment of revelation, no dramatic thunderclap. It was a slow creep, like ivy growing up a brick wall, until one day I looked and realized it was simply part of the structure. Perhaps it started with the small things, the way he'd absent-mindedly push his glasses up his nose when he was concentrating, or the specific, rumbling cadence of his voice when he was tired. Or maybe it was the bigger things, the moments of unexpected vulnerability that would crack through his energetic exterior. I remember one afternoon, sophomore year, we were sitting on a bench by the campus lake. He'd just gotten off the phone with his sister, and his face was clouded over. He told me, in a low voice, about his father's illness, a subject he never breached. He didn't look at me as he spoke, just stared out at the water, his usual confidence stripped away, leaving something raw and uncertain. And in that moment, I felt a fierce, protective surge, a desire not just to listen, but to shield him, to somehow absorb a portion of his pain. It was a dangerous feeling, and I recognized it for what it was. I took it, and I buried it deep, packing it down under layers of casual banter and easy companionship. The friendship was too important, a rare and precious ecosystem I couldn't risk disrupting with the clumsy introduction of a new, invasive species. After graduation, when the rest of our lives were scattering to the winds, we clung to each other. Getting an apartment together felt like the most natural thing in the world, a continuation of the easy symbiosis we developed. Our place was a testament to our dynamic. His tech gadgets and meticulously organized coding manuals occupied the same shelves as my art books and boxes of photo paper. His side of the living room was an orderly landscape of charging cables and ergonomic peripherals. Mine was a controlled chaos of camera bodies, lenses, and stacks of prints. We built a life in that apartment, a rhythm of shared meals and separate routines. He'd come home from his demanding job as a consultant, shedding the day's stress like a heavy coat, and I'd be in my makeshift darkroom, a converted closet, emerging hours later, smelling of developer and stop bath. He dated, of course, a series of bright, ambitious women who seemed, to me, to be reflections of his own energy. I was polite to all of them. I learned their coffee orders and made small talk at the kitchen counter. I listened to Julian's post-date analyses and offered carefully neutral advice. Each time, I felt like a spy in my own home, a quiet observer gathering intelligence on a foreign power. I watched him be a boyfriend, watched him hold hands, watched him offer a casual affection that he never directed at me, and each instance was a small, sharp paper cut on a part of my soul I kept hidden. I told myself it was for the best. It reinforced the boundaries, kept the lines clear. This is his life, I would think, and this is mine. The space between us is friendship, and that is all it can ever be. I became an expert in emotional self-containment, a curator of my own secret museum of feelings, where every exhibit was cordoned off behind velvet ropes for my viewing only. The shift, when it came, was not sudden. It was a slow erosion, the way a coastline is reshaped by a persistent tide. The catalyst was his work. Julian had been pouring himself into a massive project for over a year, a complex software integration for a major client. It was his baby, the thing that was supposed to catapult his career to the next level. He spoke of it with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, the way one might speak of summiting a treacherous mountain. He worked impossible hours, fueled by caffeine and sheer force of will. The apartment became less of a home and more of a charging station for him. I'd see him in brief flashes, a blur in the morning, a shadow late at night. The vibrant energy that had always defined him began to fray at the edges, replaced by a tense, brittle exhaustion. Then, the project collapsed. It wasn't a single, dramatic explosion, but a series of cascading failures, a slow, public unraveling. A rival firm swooped in, the client pulled out, and a year of his life's work was rendered obsolete, a footnote in a quarterly report. The night he got the final news, he walked into the apartment and didn't say a word. He just went to his room and closed the door. The silence that emanated from behind that door was heavier and more absolute than any sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a vibrant star collapsing into a black hole. In the weeks that followed, Julian became a ghost haunting our shared space. The restless energy was gone, replaced by a profound lethargy. He'd sit on the sofa for hours, staring at a blank television screen. He stopped going to the gym. He barely ate. His side of the apartment, once so orderly, began to accumulate a fine layer of dust. He was untethered, adrift in a sea of failure and exhaustion, and I had no idea how to build him a lighthouse. I tried to talk to him, but his responses were monosyllabic, clipped. He had built a wall around himself, and I didn't have the tools to breach it. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I waited. I observed. I made sure there was coffee in the pot in the morning and left a plate of food for him on the counter when I made dinner. I became the quiet, constant, unobtrusive presence in the background of his grief. The ritual began on a rainy Thursday night about a month after the collapse. I had put on an old black and white movie, something quiet and atmospheric, more for the background noise than anything else. Julian had been on the couch all day, wrapped in a blanket, a statue of misery. I sat on the opposite end, maintaining the customary buffer zone between us. For an hour, we watched in silence, the only sounds the film's score and the drumming of rain against the window panes. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to shift. He uncurled himself from his tight ball of a posture and leaned back against the cushions. A few minutes later, he slid sideways, just a few inches. My entire nervous system went on high alert. I tracked his movement with the hyper-awareness of a wildlife photographer tracking a rare, timid creature. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of agonizingly slow progress, his head came to rest on my shoulder. It was the lightest of touches, tentative, almost accidental. My body went rigid, every muscle locked. I was terrified that if I moved, if I even breathed too deeply, he would startle and retreat, and this fragile, unprecedented connection would be severed. So I sat there, perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He smelled of sleep and sorrow. His hair was soft against my neck. I could feel the slow, rhythmic pulse in his temple through the thin fabric of my shirt. It was the most intimate contact we had ever shared, and it was happening in a space of profound platonic sadness. My own long-buried feelings began to stir, a dangerous, hopeful tide rising against the sea wall of my self-control. I wanted to put my arm around him, to pull him closer, to tell him everything would be okay. But I did nothing. I simply let him rest, offering my shoulder as a silent, unmoving anchor in his storm. After about 20 minutes, his breathing deepened, and I realized he had fallen asleep. I sat there for another 2 hours, long after the movie had ended and the screen had gone black, until my shoulder ached and my leg had gone numb, a willing pillar in the ruins of his world. That night became the blueprint. It was never discussed. It was never acknowledged. But it began to happen with increasing frequency. Movie nights became our unspoken therapy. I would put something on, and he would gravitate from his end of the sofa to mine. The journey was always the same, a slow, hesitant migration across the neutral territory of the couch cushions. First, the lean. Then, the head on the shoulder. It became a silent language we both understood. His leaning was a question. Are you there? Can you hold this? My stillness was the answer. I'm here. I've got you. The ritual evolved. The head on the shoulder became a more committed lean, his entire side pressed against mine. He started to fall asleep almost instantly, as if the simple act of physical contact was a switch that shut down his anxious, worrying mind. For him, I suspected, it was about pure, uncomplicated comfort. He was so broken, so exhausted, that the primal need for solace had overridden his carefully constructed rules about personal space. He wasn't seeking romance, he was seeking refuge. He needed a warm body to tether him to the world, to remind him he wasn't floating away. But for me, it was a beautiful, exquisite torture. Each night, I would sit in the dim light of the television, a living piece of furniture, and study him. I learned the cartography of his sleeping face, the way his brow would smooth out, erasing the lines of worry that had taken up permanent residence there, the slight parting of his lips, the occasional flutter of his eyelids as he dreamed. I learned the precise weight of him, the solid, grounding pressure against my side. The couch, our cheap, lumpy, second-hand couch, became a sacred space, an altar where I was both priest and sacrifice. My own loneliness was a vast, cavernous thing, and having him there, so close, filled it and hollowed it out at the same time. It was a cruel paradox. I had never felt so close to him, and I had never been more acutely aware of the chasm that separated what this was for him and what it was for me. One afternoon, we were watching some mindless daytime television show. Julian was awake, more present than he had been in weeks. A scene came on where a ridiculously overwrought couple was tangled up together on a park bench. Julian snorted, a ghost of his old self. God, I hate that, he said, gesturing with the remote. So performative. I can't imagine anything worse than having someone draped all over me. It's so claustrophobic, he said it without a trace of irony. He said it to me, the man who had spent the better part of the last 3 months acting as his personal mattress. The words landed in the air between us, heavy and absurd. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my chest, but I swallowed it down. I just made a non-committal noise, a slight hum of agreement. The chasm widened. He was so completely unaware of the contradiction, so oblivious to what had become the central, defining feature of my nightly existence. It confirmed my darkest fear. That for him, our nightly ritual was so deeply disconnected from any romantic or physical intent that it didn't even register in the same category as cuddling. It was just a thing that happened. A human heating pad. A weighted blanket. I was a utility, not a person he was holding. The thought was a cold, sharp thing, and it lodged itself deep in my heart. The escalation that led to the turning point was so gradual, I almost didn't notice it as a distinct change. His body, in sleep, grew bolder. One night, his hand, which usually lay limp between us, twitched and then came to rest on my leg. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was just a hand, 5 fingers resting on denim, but it felt like a brand. It stayed there all night. A week later, he shifted in his sleep, turning more fully toward me, and his arm, the one that wasn't trapped beneath him, flopped gracelessly across my stomach. It was a clumsy, unconscious movement, but it felt like a deliberate transgression. It was the first time he had actively reached for me, even in sleep. And that brings us back to that Tuesday night. The night it all changed. He had had a particularly brutal day. A job interview that had gone poorly, a reminder of the professional wreckage he was still navigating. He was vibrating with a low frequency of despair when he came home. He collapsed onto the couch, and when I sat down later to put on a movie, he didn't even wait for the opening credits. He just flowed toward me like water seeking its level, his head finding my shoulder, his body pressing against mine. He was asleep in minutes. An hour later, he shifted, and the arm came up. It didn't just flop onto my stomach this time. It settled with a sense of purpose. His hand curled loosely around my side, his forearm a heavy, warm bar across my ribs. His body pulled in closer, his face buried in the crook of my neck. This was different. This was not the accidental, gravity-induced contact of before. This was an embrace. A sleeping, unconscious, but undeniable embrace. And the man giving it was the man who hated cuddling. I lay there, pinned by the weight of his arm and the sheer, crushing weight of my own hope. Every theory I had carefully constructed about this being a purely platonic, utilitarian comfort for him crumbled into dust. You don't hold a weighted blanket like this. You don't seek refuge in a piece of furniture with this kind of possessive, encompassing tenderness. The gesture was too specific, too much like something you would do to a lover. A war raged inside me. One part of my brain, the logical, self-protective part, was screaming at me. He's asleep. It means nothing. He's just seeking warmth. Don't do this to yourself. Don't build a fantasy on a twitching limb. But the other part, the part one had kept locked away for years, was whispering a dangerous, seductive counterargument. Look at the evidence. The consistency. The escalation. This is a language his conscious mind refuses to speak, but his body is shouting it from the rooftops. He feels safe with you. He needs you. I stayed awake all night. I watched the digital clock on the cable box tick over, minute by agonizing minute. 2:17, 3:42, 5:03. The city outside our window went from a low hum to a dead silence, and then began to stir again with the first tentative sounds of dawn. His arm never moved. If anything, in the deepest hours of the night, his grip tightened slightly, a subconscious reassurance. I studied the sliver of his face I could see, the dark sweep of his eyelashes against his cheek. I felt like an archaeologist who had stumbled upon a lost city, a place of incredible beauty and profound mystery. I was terrified of making a wrong move, of disturbing the delicate ruins, of breaking the spell. When the first gray light of morning began to filter through the blinds, casting long, dusty stripes across the room, his breathing began to change. It shifted from the deep, slow rhythm of sleep to something lighter, shallower. He was waking up. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. In a few moments, he would become conscious. He would realize where his arm was. He would see how we were arranged, not as friends watching a movie, but as two people who had spent the night in an intimate embrace. The plausible deniability of sleep would evaporate. He would be confronted with the evidence of his own unconscious betrayal of his stated principles. He would be mortified. He would pull away, apologize, and the fragile, unspoken intimacy we had built would be shattered forever, replaced by an unbearable awkwardness. I had to move. I had to extricate myself before he woke up, to reset the scene, to pretend this never happened. But I couldn't. My body refused to obey. It was as if his arm, his warmth, his presence, had fused me to the spot. And a part of me, a reckless, desperate part, wanted him to wake up. I wanted to see what would happen. I wanted this silent conversation to finally be forced into the open. His eyelids fluttered. He made a low, sleepy sound in his throat. He shifted, and his face nuzzled closer into my neck. My heart stopped. He was awake. I could feel it. He was conscious, and he was not moving his arm. He was not pulling away. He was, in fact, pressing closer. A long, silent minute passed. It was the loudest silence I have ever experienced. I could feel the frantic pulse in my own neck, right where his lips were almost touching. Then his voice, a rough, morning whisper, spoken into my skin. Leo. It was barely a sound, just a puff of warm air shaped into my name. I couldn't speak. I couldn't form a word. I just waited. Another long pause. His arm was still there, solid, unmoving. Is this, he started, his voice thick with sleep and something else. Confusion? Fear? Is this okay? The question hung in the air, a fragile, shimmering thing. Is this okay? He wasn't asking if it was okay that he had fallen asleep on me. He wasn't asking if my arm was numb or if I was comfortable. He was asking about the embrace. He was asking about the arm that was still wrapped around me, the arm he was now consciously choosing not to move. He was asking for permission for a thing he had already done. It was an admission. It was a confession. And in that moment, all the years of quiet observation, of careful analysis, of buried feelings, they all coalesced into a single, simple truth. The risk of speaking was immense, but the risk of staying silent was unbearable. I finally found my own voice. It was as quiet as his, a little unsteady. Yes, I whispered back. It's okay. He let out a breath, a slow, deep sigh of what sounded like relief. His body seemed to relax even further, melting into mine. His arm, if it was even possible, held me a little tighter. And then, he did something that completely and utterly dismantled me. He tilted his head back just enough to look at me. His eyes were heavy-lidded with sleep, his hair a mess. He looked younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. There was a universe of unspoken things in that gaze. Months of grief, years of friendship, a terrifying, dawning new question. He searched my face for a moment, and I let him. I let him see everything I had kept hidden for so long. I didn't know what he would find, but I was done hiding. The darkroom was open. The image was developing right before our eyes. Julian, I started to say, though I had no idea what would come next. He stopped me, not with a word, but by leaning in, slowly, tentatively, closing the last inch of space between us. His lips met mine. It was not a passionate kiss. It was not demanding or certain. It was soft and hesitant and deeply uncertain. It was a question, just like his whispered words had been. It was the gentlest of inquiries, a testing of the waters. It tasted of sleep and coffee-less morning breath and a profound, bone-deep loneliness. I responded with equal gentleness, a quiet affirmation. It was a kiss that lasted only a few seconds, but it redrew the entire map of our world. When he pulled back, the terror was finally visible on his face. The realization of what he had just done seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He scrambled backwards, untangling himself from me with a clumsy, panicked haste. The warmth was gone. The arm was gone. He was on the far side of the couch, staring at me as if I were a stranger, as if he were a stranger to himself. I'm sorry, he stammered, his voice cracking. I shouldn't have. I don't know why. He didn't finish the sentence. He just stood up, ran a hand through his already chaotic hair, and practically fled the room. I heard his bedroom door click shut, a sound of finality, a sound of a drawbridge being pulled up, a fortress being sealed. I was left alone in the living room, in the gray morning light, the imprint of his body still warm on the couch next to me. The ghost of his lips was on mine. My world had been cracked wide open, and I had no idea if it was the beginning of a new day or the beginning of the end. The days that followed were a masterclass in avoidance. The easy, comfortable silence that had once defined our cohabitation was replaced by a tense, humming void. We were two electrons with the same charge, repelling each other in the confined space of our apartment. He left for work before I was awake and came home long after I had retreated to my room. The couch, our sacred space, went unused. It sat in the middle of the living room like a monument to a fallen civilization. The ritual was broken. The silent language we had developed was now a dead tongue. I was adrift. The brief, blinding hope of that morning had given way to a gnawing, painful confusion. I replayed the kiss, the question, the embrace, over and over in my mind, analyzing them like one of my own photographs, searching for meaning in the light and shadows. Had I imagined the tenderness? Had I misinterpreted the desperation in his eyes as affection? He had initiated it. He had asked if it was okay. And then he had run. He had apologized. That apology was the cruelest part. It was a negation of the entire event, a stamp of mistake on the most honest moment we had ever shared. My carefully guarded heart, which had dared to peek out from behind its walls, was now bruised and aching. The pain was worse than the years of quiet, unrequited pining. That had been a dull, chronic ache I had learned to live with. This was a sharp, acute agony. It was the pain of being given something precious and then having it snatched away, with the implication that it should never have been offered in the first place. I felt foolish, exposed. He had been grieving, vulnerable, and I had let my own selfish desires color the situation, seeing romance where there was only a desperate need for human contact. He was right to run. He was probably horrified, disgusted with himself for crossing a line with his sad, quiet, gay roommate. The thought made me sick. After a week of this suffocating silence, I knew I couldn't endure it any longer. The ambiguity was eating me alive. I would rather have a clean, painful break than this slow death by 1,000 unspoken tensions. I needed to know. I needed to hear it from him, whatever it was. I needed him to either detonate the bomb or disarm it, but I could no longer live with the ticking. I waited for him that night. I didn't sit on the couch. I stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, a cup of long cold tea in my hands. It was almost midnight when I heard his key in the lock. He walked in, looking exhausted, his shoulders slumped. He saw me and froze, a deer caught in the headlights. His first instinct was to retreat, to mutter a greeting and disappear into his room. I saw the impulse flicker across his face. "Julian," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We need to talk," he flinched. He let his briefcase slide from his hand to the floor with a heavy thud. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the scuffed linoleum. "Leo, I'm really tired, I don't care," I said, and the sharpness in my own tone surprised me. "I can't do this anymore. This silence. This pretending we're strangers who happen to share a lease. You owe me more than that." He finally lifted his head. His eyes were shadowed, filled with a misery that mirrored my own. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice low and defeated. "The truth," I said, my voice softening. "Whatever it is. Just the truth. What happened last Tuesday? And why did you run away?" He let out a shaky breath and leaned his back against the closed door, as if he needed it to hold him up. He looked trapped. "I told you. I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking straight. I was half asleep. It was a mistake." Each word was a hammer blow. A mistake. The word I had been dreading. But I couldn't leave it there. I had to push. "Was it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because it didn't feel like a mistake. You asked me if it was okay. You were awake, Julian." He closed his eyes, a pained expression on his face. "I don't know what I was doing," he said, his voice cracking. "Everything's been so messed up since the project died. I'm not myself, so what was I?" I asked, the question tearing out of me, raw and ragged. What have I been for the last 3 months? Was I just a convenient source of warmth? A body pillow? Because you have to understand how it looked from my side. You, the man who claims to hate cuddling, spent every single night asleep in my arms. And it wasn't just sleep, Julian. You held on to me. And that morning, that wasn't an accident. So you have to tell me what it meant. Even if the answer is that it meant nothing. I need to hear you say it. A tear escaped from under his closed eyelid and traced a path down his cheek. Then another. He didn't make a sound, just stood there, silently crying. The sight of it broke through my anger, leaving only a deep, profound ache. I pushed myself off the counter and took a hesitant step toward him. I was so scared, he finally whispered, his voice thick and choked. He opened his eyes, and they were swimming with a confusion and fear so potent it was palpable. I woke up, and I was holding you. And my first thought wasn't, oh God, this is weird. My first thought was, this is right. It was the first time I had felt safe, really, truly safe, in months. It was quiet. It was warm, and I didn't want to move. Ever. And that terrified me. He took a shuddering breath. I don't think about guys that way. I never have. My whole life has been on this one, straight track. And then you. You've always been this constant, steady thing in my life. My best friend. My anchor. And somewhere along the way, in all that grief and exhaustion, the lines got blurry. Lying there with you, it wasn't about sex. It was about, I don't know, peace. It was a kind of peace I've never felt with anyone. Not with any of my girlfriends. Not with anyone. He finally looked me straight in the eye, his own gaze filled with a desperate plea for understanding. When I kissed you, it was an impulse. It was like I just had to know if that feeling of peace had a taste. And then my brain caught up. The one that runs on logic and rules. And it just started screaming. What are you doing? This is Leo. Your best friend. Your roommate. You're going to destroy the most important friendship you have. You're going to break everything. So I ran. I ran because I was a coward. I was terrified of what it meant about me, and I was even more terrified of what it would do to us. All the air went out of my lungs. All the anger, all the hurt, it all just evaporated, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He wasn't disgusted by the kiss. He was terrified by how right it felt. He hadn't been using me. He had been finding a home in me, and he didn't know how to read the address. I closed the remaining distance between us and gently reached out, placing my hand on his arm. He flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. You didn't break anything, I said softly. But you almost did, by shutting me out. The silence was breaking us, not the kiss. I looked at him, at this brilliant, vibrant man who had been reduced to a bundle of fear and confusion. I saw the years of our friendship, the late nights in the library, the shared laughter, the quiet support. And I saw the last few months, the slow, painful erosion of his spirit and the desperate, unconscious way he had reached for me. You don't have to have it all figured out, Julian. I continued, my voice low and even. You don't have to put a label on it tonight. But we can't go back to pretending. We can't unring that bell. All I'm asking is that you don't run. Talk to me. Be scared with me. Be confused with me. But don't leave me on the other side of a locked door again. He searched my face, his own expression softening from terror into a fragile, tentative hope. He nodded slowly, a single, jerky movement. Okay, he whispered. Okay. No more running. We stood there in the harsh light of the kitchen for a long time. The silence between us no longer a humming void, but a space for breathing. It was the beginning of a new kind of quiet, one built not on avoidance, but on a shared, terrifying, and beautiful uncertainty. We had found the edge of the map, and for the first time, it felt like we might be able to explore what lay beyond it, together. That conversation was not a magic fix. It was the opening of a door that had been sealed shut, letting in a sliver of light. The days that followed were tentative, careful. We were like two people learning to walk again after a long illness. We talked. We actually talked, for the first time, about the unspoken things. He told me about the pressure he'd always felt to follow a certain path, to meet a certain set of expectations. I told him, haltingly at first, about the feelings I had kept hidden for years, not as an accusation, but as a piece of the puzzle he was trying to solve. We started to rebuild. We sat on the couch again, but we sat at opposite ends, the space between us a symbol of our mutual caution. But we would talk, our voices low in the dark, the television often forgotten. We were relearning each other, discovering the new topography of our relationship. It was fragile, delicate work. About a week after our talk, we were watching a movie, the old habit returning, but with new rules. The space between us felt vast. I could feel him looking at me, even in the dim light. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet. "Yeah." My side of the couch is cold. It wasn't a statement of fact. It was a question. It was a permission slip being offered. My heart gave a hopeful, painful lurch. I took a deep breath. "Mine too," I said. He shifted then, moving across the cushions, but this time it was different. It wasn't the slow, unconscious migration of a sleeping man. It was a deliberate, conscious choice. He stopped a few inches away from me, leaving the final decision in my hands. I turned toward him, and it was all the invitation he needed. He settled against me, his head finding its familiar place on my shoulder. But this time, I didn't freeze. I didn't become a statue. I lifted my arm and wrapped it around his shoulders, pulling him closer. He let out a soft sigh and tucked his head into my neck, his hand coming to rest on my chest, right over my heart. It was the same position we had been in that fateful morning, but everything was different. There was no ambiguity. There was no plausible deniability. This was not an accident. It was a choice. It was a statement. We sat like that for the rest of the film, not speaking. We didn't need to. For the first time, the silence was completely comfortable, filled not with questions, but with a quiet, shared understanding. This was our new language. We began to heal in that beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. We didn't rush. We didn't try to define what we were becoming. We simply let it unfold, one quiet, intentional gesture at a time. The cuddling was no longer a ritual born of grief, but an act of mutual affection. Sometimes we would talk, our voices murmuring in the dark. Other times, we would just hold each other, listening to the rhythm of each other's breathing. He still fell asleep on me, but now, when he did, I would kiss the top of his head before I drifted off myself. The world outside our apartment, with all its demands and expectations, seemed to fade away. Our living room became an island, a safe harbor. We were creating a new kind of home, not with bricks and mortar, but with vulnerability and trust. The architecture of our relationship was being redrawn, the old boundaries dissolving, replaced by open doorways and shared spaces. The line between friend and more than friend had been erased, and in its place was just us. One Saturday morning, months later, I woke up first. We were in my bed, something that had become a natural, unspoken progression. The morning light was filtering through the blinds, painting stripes across the blankets. Julian was still sound asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful. His arm was thrown across my chest, his hand resting near my shoulder. His breathing was a steady, warm presence against my back. It was a scene of such profound, simple domesticity that it took my breath away. I thought back to that first night on the couch, to my panic and my desperate hope, to the feeling of being a willing captive. Now, there was no captivity. There was only a deep, quiet sense of belonging. The man who hated cuddling had found a home in my arms. And I, the quiet observer, had finally found the courage to step out from behind the lens and into the picture. I was no longer just documenting the moment. I was living in it. And it was more beautiful than any photograph I could ever take.